Hey guys, what's going on? It's Ash here. Before we get into today's video, which should be a great one, I'm excited to tell you guys that I now have apparel merch for CWA. You guys have helped me create some funny slogans and stuff like that. You can get hoodies and t-shirts and tank tops in a variety of colors. I'll include the link at the top line in the pinned comment in today's video. If you tweet me a picture of you wearing any of my gear, I'll be sure to retweet it and show you guys some love. So guys, without further ado, let's hear from one of our guests in today's video to bring us into the intro.
This is Electrify, and you're watching the Pro Tip series on CWA Mobile Gaming, starring me.
Hey guys, how you doing? It's Ash here. Welcome to the main video. Took me a while to get there, but we are here, darn it. And we're going to be covering a HOG cycle deck using Tornado. And I got a comment a few videos ago about that one of my subscribers felt intimidated by the Tornado, where to place it. So I just want to show you real quickly before we get into the real meat of the video here, where to place the Tornado to activate it for a Miner and a Goblin Barrel right over here. The previous little replay was against an Ewiz, and against a Hog Rider, you want to put it one tile above the corner of your King Tower to activate the King Tower with the incoming Hog Rider. Then after that, you just want to pull the Hog to the center of the arena so that it's in range. Make sure your Vortex is right one square on the side of the center to where the Hog is coming for, and that will put your Hog in range of all three of your towers, including the activated King Tower. So hopefully that kind of helps out a few of you guys who haven't really played the Tornado too much lately, who have still been using the cannon, that old-fashioned cannon, in your HOG cycle deck. Not to say that the cannon's not useful, but having the Tornado in here actually gives us a really strong defensive weapon for one of our weakest matchups, which is Graveyard deck, Splash Yard. And we can activate the King Tower and then have that extra ammo to provide us defense against Graveyard, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But let's get into the players, or the pros, I should say, who are actually going to help me with this deck guide today. We have Electrify, who's been on the channel many times, and then we have Luis and RomK7. All three of these guys are perennial top 200 players. They're really good at pushing HOG decks on ladders, especially. And this deck does great on ladder no matter what arena you guys are in. I think will prove that it will be the most effective and certainly one of the strongest HOG decks, HOG cycle decks more specifically, inside the meta right now. So let's get into these replays here, and while we do so, let's go ahead and start out with the offense. Real quick side note, real quick guys, is this is going to be a two-part episode or a two-part series. This first episode is going to be just a deck review using the pros tips and replays, and the second one is going to be me trophy pushing on my free-to-play account and my main account towards the end of the season, maybe a week or two from now, and we'll see how high I can get. I want to get new personal bests using this HOG cycle deck on both of my accounts, because I am a big fan of HOG cycle decks, and I think I'm pretty good with them compared to being average at most other archetypes. So anyway, moving into the offensive strategy for this deck. From Electrify, by the way, he did a big write-up on this deck, so I do want to thank him. He's the guy who also brought us into the intro after my little advertisement for my apparel shop. Is that too official sounding? I don't know. My t-shirt shop, okay? So, offense. You don't want to start out with a Hog as your opening play. Now, this is why this is an old deck, but new rules to the deck, because we're going to actually give you advice to counter the current meta, not the meta of a year ago when people were playing decks like this. Okay, so you don't want to play your Hog. Back in the day, it was totally cool to start out a match with an aggressive Hog play, maybe a Hog Skeleton or a Hog Ice Spirit. Not anymore. Too much bridge spam going around. And the same thing goes for an Elixir Pump. It's not in this deck, but you don't want to start out with a Pump anymore. It's okay to start out with a Hog. It's okay to start out with a Pump, but it shouldn't be the opening move. In other words, you have to wait for your opponent to make a move first. So remember that. No aggressive Hog plays, and ideally, Electrify says he has a little rule of thumb for HOG cycle decks. What he does is he tries not to make the first play at all until 240, until 20 seconds into the match. This is not a deck where you can simply outweight your opponent on the first move, because this deck actually shines in the first 2 minutes, not a double elixir time, not the last minute of the match. So we don't want to waste our whole first 2 minutes simply waiting out the opponent to make the first move. That's a good idea in a beatdown deck. That's a great idea in a 3 Musketeer deck when you have the advantage in overtime and double elixir time. But any deck that you guys play, you should have kind of a keen awareness of where your deck shines and make sure you don't waste the first 2 minutes with a fast cycle deck if that's not going to be where your deck's going to have the, if that is going to be where your deck's going to have the advantage, okay? So remember, don't go too much more than 20 seconds without making a play. What if your opponent doesn't make a play and you have to make a play and it's 20 or 30 seconds into the match? Well, then you can just cycle your skeletons in the back or start cycling your knight in the back. One thing that Electrify does not do in the current meta is cycle the Ice Spirit either at the bridge or in the back. That's a big no-no now because you need that Ice Spirit. It's going to play a really important role against 2 defensive cards that you're going to have to account for. Number 1 is minions or anything flying. You're going to be relying on your Ice Spirit, your Fireball, and your Tornado to stop them. And number 2, of course, is the Battle Ram. You need to save your Ice Spirit to see if your opponent has Battle Ram. You're really going to be relying heavily. So you don't want to just cycle it willy-nilly. It's going to be wasted if you have to stop a Battle Ram or stop minions or a minion horde. So no Ice Spirit to start out the match. So we talked about starting plays. We talked about offense, but let's talk a little bit more about the HOG. We know we're not going to open with the HOG, but what about when are you playing the HOG? Is it an aggressive deck? Is it not an aggressive deck? Well, Electrify says this is not an aggressive deck. And that's funny too, because people think fast decks must be an aggressive deck. I must be always keeping that big tempo offensively, but that's not the case with this deck. You want to kind of pick and choose when to use your HOG. You don't want to throw it out there just because it's a HOG cycle deck. Doesn't mean you're going to be throwing out that HOG every single time you get the chance, every single time it's back in your hand. We use the term out-cycle your opponent. And all that means is if you're able to cycle to your HOG faster than your opponent's able to cycle to their one big defensive stopper to the HOG, let's pretend they have a cannon or an Inferno Tower, then you can out-cycle your opponent and then you can spam the HOG. But what if your opponent, like in the current meta, has 2 or 3 or more counters to your HOG Rider? Well, then it would not behoove you to just send in your HOG when you know they're always carrying a counter, okay? So in this deck, we're going to be playing it not super aggressively. We generally want to defend first. It's okay to send in a HOG, not as their first play, but it's okay to send in a solo HOG as kind of a scouting play. That's totally acceptable, and you're going to have to do that at some point, right? You're not always going to have to defend against a big push first. You have to play some cards eventually, and you want to find out what your opponent has to counter your HOG Rider. So sending in a HOG by himself or a HOG with an Ice Spirit, 30 seconds, 40 seconds into the match isn't a bad play. But there's really what you want to do is find out how they can counter you and then send in the HOG after you counter them. So as a counter attack when they're not a high on elixir, when they're not sitting at 10 elixir with all the counters in their hand. So there is a little bit of a chess match into when and where to play your HOG Rider. Now, I mentioned where to play your HOG Rider. Well, there's 2 cases that Electrify advises switching lanes. So this is really interesting. This is something that I don't do as a player, so I really took this advice to heart. And one is obvious. This is something I do. Do? Whatever. So this is something I do inside the game, right? Is when they drop that golem, I mean, every HOG player knows this by now. When they drop that golem in the back, when they drop that giant in the back, you want to drop your Musketeer first, and then you want to send your HOG in the opposite lane. That's going to do 2 things. By placing the Musketeer first, it's going to allow you to cycle back to the Musketeer on defense because you're going to need it probably later. You'll probably need 2 Musketeers, whether it's a Lava Hound or a Giant or a Golem dropped by your opponent. This is how you defend with this deck, guys. If you see that big tank, let's pretend it's a Lava Hound. You drop your Musketeer immediately behind your tower. Then you send in the HOG in the opposite lane, even if you're not going against that tower. Because what that's going to do is 2 things. Number 1 is it's going to cause your opponent to have to react to the HOG, otherwise you'll take the tower. So that's going to be more elixir subverted from their main push. And the second thing it's going to allow you to do is cycle back to your second Musketeer faster because you're placing her first, understanding proper cycling, right? You're placing your Musketeer first, your opponent will use their direct damage spell, kill your first Musketeer, and then you'll have the second Musketeer in hand to defend after they've used their spell. So we're talking about defense a little bit right now. We were supposed to be talking about offense, but that's such a key point in this deck that, you know, you drop the Musketeer first and you hit the opposite lane. Now, what about that other circumstance I talked about, switching lanes? This is something that was really interesting, like I said before, and that is when you're sending in, you defended, right? You defended and you have a leftover Musketeer or a leftover Knight. Maybe you have a leftover Knight and Musketeer from defending against your opponent's push. 99% of players are going to send in the Hog with the Knight and the Musketeer. I mean, that's what this deck is all about, right? Well, Electrify says differently. He said he's going to switch things up, and about half the times, he's going to send in that Hog on the opposite lane. So I talked about switching lanes, and what that's going to do is a split push, essentially. And it's going to cause your opponent, especially an inexperienced opponent, to panic a little bit. Think about Three Musketeers split. It always causes your opponent to kind of scramble a little bit. Even me, as someone who plays Three Musketeers, when I go against Three Musketeers, sometimes I'm like, oh crap, what card am I going to play next, and how am I going to stop both of these Three Musketeer lanes? So the Hog, with this deck, you can kind of do the same thing. You can switch it up and send in the Hog on the opposite lane. This is going to make your opponent have to defend both lanes. You have a Knight and a Musketeer in one lane. You have a Hog in the other lane. And think about it, it still only costs 4 elixir from you because you had the leftover defenses already from that defensive sequence in the Knight and the Musketeer. Even if it's just a Musketeer, now they have a Musketeer they have to stop and they have a Hog they have to stop, instead of simply using one Tornado and a Knight to stop your one big push. So there's a lot of different strategy elements that you can do to kind of stay one step ahead inside that mental chess match that we talked about. So let's talk about defense. We talked a lot about defense. We talked about how to handle a tank deck. And, of course, you can use your Tornado in between the Musketeer cycling. You can use your Knight on defense. You can use your cycle cards. You have a lot of weapons at your disposal while you're trying to cycle to that next Musketeer against the tank decks. But as far as your main defensive weapons, obviously, they're the Knight, they're the Musketeer, and the Skeletons. You have the Ice Spirit for those circumstances, which we already talked about. You want to hold your Ice Spirit. Ice Spirit and NATO is your main defense along with Fireball. You want to use Tornado and Fireball into double elixir time more aggressively. Sometimes there's a big push. Maybe it's a Night Witch, a Baby Dragon, and a Golem or a Giant coming at you. Using a Tornado Fireball, especially if there's minions or a Goblin Gang in the mix there, you can get tremendous value from 7 elixir and often take out more than 10 elixir, or at least kind of stymie the push coming in using that combination. Now, speaking of double elixir, you don't have to apply as much pressure to the opposite lane whenever they drop that big tank. So it switches a little bit. In single elixir, you have a go-to strategy that we just talked about, how you're going to handle those big beatdown pushes. Now, in double elixir time, you have a little bit more leeway, as does your opponent. But you can go a little bit heavier on your Hog cycle, and you can start to cycle like we talked about was a no-no in the first 2 minutes, where whenever the Hog's in your hand, if you have the ability to outpace your opponent's counter, you can go ahead and do that. You can go ahead and play your Hog more aggressively. But ideally, with this deck, as in any cycle deck, any chip deck for that matter, you want to walk into double elixir time with the advantage, because that's when this deck is not going to do as well. It's going to be performing a little bit more poorly than a beatdown deck. So you'd like to have at least one of their towers down going into double elixir time, or at least in spell cycle range. So that's how you're going to handle defense with this deck. Now, against Lava Loon, you're gonna be using the same musky cycle type situations, type formula that we already talked about. Let's talk a little bit about the biggest mistakes for this deck. We talked already about never throwing the Hog as the opening play, but how about this one? Never put your Hog down when you only have 4 elixir. That's another new one for me, and that's a rule that Electrify calls the golden rule. It's a rule that he lives by on Hog decks. I found that interesting because that's something that I do pretty often, because sometimes you defend, you don't have any leftover troops after you defended, but you think your opponent is really low on elixir, so you send in that Hog. Why not? This is the time that you want to attack. But Electrify says it's a big no-no. You never want to send in the Hog and leave yourself with absolutely no elixir left to defend, because you never know when they hit you with that bandit in the opposite lane and you're sitting on nothing, you know? So it's important to never leave yourself with 0 elixir. So you're not going to be playing your Hog in double elixir time. It's a little bit different. You might be able to cycle really quickly to Ice Spirit Skeletons to immediately stop that incoming bandit or battle ram or log or whatever, you know? But especially in single elixir, you don't want to be sending in the Hog when you only have 4 elixir in your storage. Now, overcommitting on pushes is another thing that Electrify mentioned, and this is another interesting topic here. Electrify said, and this will be a good ending to the video today, Electrify said, you never want to, just because you have leftover defensive units such as a knight or a musketeer, doesn't mean you always have to push for the Hog. So that's a smart thing too. You want to make sure you leave yourself some elixir to defend, and sometimes that means just letting the musketeer go, letting the knight go, and it really depends on the game situation, the circumstances, on whether you should do that or not. But a lot has to do with whether you have the elixir advantage or if you're at a deficit in elixir. If you're at a deficit, you don't want to go ahead with an aggressive hound attack on the counter push. So always try to be aware, how much is my opponent committing to this push, and are they still in the elixir lead? If that's the case, then don't send in the Hog. Wait and let them counter your musketeer or your knight. So guys, that is pretty much going to do it for this video. I think that we touched on some real valuable tips for Hog cycle decks, some tips that we haven't discussed, especially for the current meta, in any of my previous Hog cycle deck reviews. So I just wanted to give a huge shout out to all the guys who helped with this video: Electrify, Luis, and RomK. There's been some great replays going on in the background, and another one right here. And this is actually Hog cycle versus, I believe, a Hog, more heavier Hog deck. And you guys, you know, you can learn a lot from just the replay. So don't be afraid to go back through this episode and watch me double, and make sure you watch the ads 3 times. Joking, but seriously, don't be afraid to go back and watch these replays with me on mute if you just want to get a good feel for you know, the science behind the moves that you make, and really picking up on what these players do and repeating it is the best way, in my opinion, to succeed in this game and to get better. So guys, huge shout out to my YouTube partner, Bren Chong. He is amazing. Make sure you give him some love. Follow him on Twitter and Instagram. Guys, thank you so much for watching, and as always, take care, guys.